Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone who's joined us today. Thank you for joining us to discuss the unfair climate crisis. I'm Kate Nkatha, dialing in from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm the commercial director at Fairtrade Africa, where myself and my team members support 1.2 million farmers to grow products that make eventual products that you love, like cocoa, for chocolate, etc. I'm also a child of a tea farm, so I really know where this is. As we celebrate Fairtrade Fortnight, it is time to ask why the impacts of climate change are so unfair. The unequal impact of the climate crisis has been made plain this week in the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change IPCC report. Amongst its findings, identifying how climate risks and other disadvantages like food insecurity, gender discrimination, and low incomes are linked, the report noted human mortality from floods, droughts, and storms was 15 times higher in highly vulnerable communities. But crucially, we'll also discuss how we can change things to win a fairer future for the people and the planet, and the communities affiliated. At the launch of the IPCC report, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated that he takes inspiration from all those on the front line of climate crisis, fighting back with solutions. And that is what we are going to do this evening. Here is a short message from one of these groups on the front line of the climate crisis, fighting back with solutions. These are Fairtrade farmers. Let's watch as they explain why climate justice matters and why we need to talk about it during Fairtrade Fortnight. Enjoy.
Today, millions of farming families and their communities stand on the front line of a climate crisis they have done the least to cause. As extreme weather events become more frequent, soil, crops, and livelihoods are lost or damaged.
The prolonged drought that we've been facing has led to drying up of our crops, and too much rain has led to some effects to my crops, like my cabbages, to too much cold. There was something like blight. Those are some of the impacts that we're getting from this climate change.
There are a lot of challenges due to the climate issue. The drought is so severe, there's no rain for the flower to sustain, so most of the flowers are aborted. And at the period where we need these flowers to produce pods, we lose them all. We also have disease, pests, which is also affecting most of our producing cocoa.
These communities face rising costs from COVID-19 on top of the devastation from climate change. This leaves them unable to invest in ways to adapt to a changing climate and farming methods that protect their environment. We all rely on farmers to produce the food we need. 80% of the world's food comes from 500 million family farms. Farming communities are already taking action to protect ecosystems and developing climate-resilient farming methods.
I've got many trees here. I'm trying to create some shade, and that's why you can see I have planted trees in my farm so that I can control the climate that I need.
But they need financial support to make those changes happen.
If we want to stop climate issues, then that is where we call on people to come and then support us financially.
Urgent action on climate is a matter of justice. Climate finance must reach the communities most affected by climate change. These communities also hold solutions to farming in ways that will protect the fragile environments. Low prices for their products cause a vicious cycle of low productivity and declining incomes, and leaves farmers financially unable to face up to the challenge of climate change. Farmers struggle to cover their basic needs, food, education, and healthcare, let alone to pay for ways to adapt or to protect their harvests from extreme weather. Fairtrade works with producers to strengthen their ability to face climate challenges with resources, training, and knowledge.
We can support the farmers to manage climate change. Number one, by raising awareness. Number two, giving them training on good agricultural practices that will help to increase their coffee production. Number three, supporting them with alternative income generating activities so that they can have more than one income stream.
Our trading system is weighted against low-income farmers. Now more than ever, they need fair pay, fair prices, and fairer trading practices. Your choices make a difference. Choose fair trade. Support farmers fighting the climate crisis.
Sends a message home. Just a reminder that all our online events in the festival are free to attend. But if you'd like to support farmers and workers on the front line of climate crisis, please donate what you can today by scanning the QR code on your screen or visiting our website, fairtrade.org.uk. Follow us on Instagram, tweet away on Twitter. We are at hashtag Fairtrade Fortnight, hashtag choose the world you want. Now let's reflect on the powerful video we've just heard from Fairtrade farmers from across the world. They have done the least to contribute to the climate crisis, but are feeling the worst effects. And unfair trade systems mean too often farmers and workers behind our everyday goods don't earn enough money for essentials. We heard they can't even get sufficient resources for food, for healthcare, let alone fighting climate crisis. Never mind, they still have to adapt to the climate change based on the earnings that they get. Why is it that those unable to earn enough to meet their essential needs are also feeling the worst effects of climate change? Why is it that around the world, it's the Black, the Brown, the indigenous communities feeling the worst effects of the climate change? Why is it that those least responsible for causing the climate change are left to deal with the consequences? And what can we do to tackle this issue together? Tonight, we have an exciting panel from across the world, from Rwanda, from Mexico, and from UK, joining us to talk about this issue. Let's start with Dr. Mithika Mwenda. He's joining us from Kigali in Rwanda. He's a co-founder of an African climate change activism organization called Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And he is a climate advocate with decades of experience campaigning for climate justice across Africa. Dr. Mithika, you co-founded Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, commonly known as PACJA. What motivated you to do this? And what do you think climate justice means in an African context?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening to all from Kigali. And I'm very excited to be part of this. Thank you, Kate, to mentioning that you are a daughter of tea. I also want to mention that I'm a son of tea. My parents were small older tea farmers and also coffee farmers, and they are actually the other front line of the crisis we are experiencing. So they experience it firsthand, and the money to educate us comes from this commodity, and they are actually the ones facing this challenge. So what motivated me among other colleagues and allies to come up with this platform was sheer, passion and the urge to elevate and amplify our voice in international discourse on climate change. For the past 30 or so years, the global community has been meeting under the auspices on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And before, 10 years ago, this discourse was about environment and science. We never used to link this space with what farmers are doing, smallholder farmers. We never really related this with really what is happening, the disappearance of rivers, the manifestations of climate, which we are seeing, the rain-fed agriculture, the erratic rainfall patterns, and the shifting seasons. So after learning this, we thought that it would be important to link this so that we broaden the discourse, and then we bring organizations which are actually working for farmers like us, women organization, farmers groups like the farmers who are my father and mother, which are members of PAJA, the indigenous communities, farmers groups, so that now we democratize the discourse. We make it big so that now the discussion is not about science, about environment, is about our lives, about our livelihoods, about climate, about farmers. It's a farmers issue, fair trade issue, so that we advance what we are calling people-centered, rights-based, equitable, just and inclusive approach to climate response delivered through the platforms which we have established. So coming then to the what we call our interpretation on climate justice in the African perspective is that African, it was caused by the rich countries in their process of development during the Industrial Revolution. And so, while this was happening, the people who are suffering then, according even to the IPCC report, which has been mentioned by Kate, is the farmers, the people who have very little to do with this problem. Equitable, ecologically just, and responsible to the needs of those most vulnerable. Those are the smallholder producers of tea, coffee, cocoa, and those others who are suffering now because of their productivity. Secondly, responsible for climate change. That is, those whose mode of production and consumption has resulted in accumulation of these greenhouse gases in their should own up to their mistakes, take deliberate measure to stop such mistakes, and then revert to the sustainable development pathways. And thirdly, is climate justice means those who have caused the climate change should own up and repay their debt, provide money and resources to help these farmers on agriculture now that they cannot rely on rain-fed agriculture because the atmosphere has been destroyed, so that they either diversify and adapt to the impacts of the problem which is not theirs. Fourthly, is climate justice means giving those who have no voice, those are smallholder farmers, coffee farmers, those women producers, and those who are feeling the biggest impacts of climate change, sufficient space and voice to articulate their challenges and solutions. In other words, those at the front line of climate change should be proactively engaged in such processes as UNFCCC, regional climate change processes, as well as national and subnational sectoral thematic conversation deals towards framing policies that are interventions to address climate change. So in a nutshell, those are just very briefly what we see as African perspectives on climate justice.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mithika is very passionate about climate justice. And he was at COP26, and so is our second panelist, Louis VI, who is also joining us from the UK, from Mexico, actually, tonight. Louis was invited to speak at COP26 last year in Glasgow, Scotland, curating and presenting the acclaimed Nature Ain't a Luxury event, featuring a panel of young people of color climate activists. Louis, your work centers on climate justice and social justice, aiming to make climate conversations more accessible and more diverse. What first inspired you to bring awareness of climate inequalities through your music and art? And what does climate justice really mean to you?
First of all, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be in this panel with such amazing people that are doing such amazing work. So thanks, and good evening and good morning to some of you who are on the same time zone as me. I'm from London and I'm mixed race with my family. My dad's side of the family draw an ancestry from Dominica, a tiny little nature island in the Caribbean. And in answer to your question, what first brought me into this climate justice world, I've always been a nature geek. I've always loved it. But in 2017, Hurricane Maria hit Dominica. The same hurricane also hit Puerto Rico, which is one of the strongest hurricanes to ever make landfall in recorded history. And it was unequivocally because of the exacerbation of weather systems from climate change. And this is a tiny island of 50,000 people. They couldn't have contributed less to the climate change issue we see today. Yet, these people on the front line suffering the most. And to see that level of devastation, it was something that I've always the climate crisis is something I've always been passionate about, but that was like a direct pulling in for me. And I was like, this couldn't be more unfair that, these people are suffering for the burning of another person's oil in the Western, and to support the Western and Eurocentric lifestyle. These people are suffering on the front line. So that, directly pulled me in, and I started looking for ways to use my art and my music to pull other people in like me and activate other people in, particularly people of color, the diaspora in the West, because I feel like we are uniquely positioned as people almost like moles in the Western world that is the cause of this climate crisis we find ourselves in. But we're intrinsically, fundamentally, and deeply linked to the places that we come from in the global South that are on the front line now. So we have a unique position to be the megaphones for these indigenous communities and Black and brown places that we are proud to be from, and to raise and elevate their voices to the front of this conversation. And what does climate justice mean to me? I guess it means the people that have caused this must pay for it, and the people that have the solutions that are on the front line, most of all indigenous communities that know how to exist and work harmoniously with the land, need to be not just elevated, but need to be in these policy making rooms.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear the personal connections from you, Louis, and Dr. Mithika that push you to actually act. And that's why we're holding this fortnight event, for you to hear from the people that are affected the most, and for those who are doing something about it. And we have yet another very passionate panelist, Namrata Chowdhary, also joining us from the UK. Nama brings decades of experience mobilizing grassroots community action to take on the climate crisis. At 350.org, she campaigns community activism and community-led solutions to climate change. Nama, you have done a lot of work around intersections of inequality of race, gender, and privilege. How have you seen this overlap in the experience of communities on the front line of climate crisis? And what can communities or community alliances learn from each other towards addressing these multiple challenges?
Thank you, Kate. That's such a profound question, because really the answer lies at the heart of how we need to address the climate crisis. If we consider the unfair burden that is carried by communities of color, by women, by non-binary people, and if you think about the struggles for racial justice or class justice all over the world, like so many other aspects of our human reality, the effects of the climate crisis are indeed felt most deeply and carried most strongly by communities like these that have historically been deprived of their rights. Previously colonized countries or historically dominated communities, those who, like Louis VI just pointed out, are supporting the extravagant lifestyles of those with privilege, right? These are the ones that are experiencing the climate crisis as well and are holding the responsibility of being first adapters to the climate crisis. As my colleagues in the Pacific team of 350.org, they come together as the Pacific Climate Warriors, as they brought this message to the COP26 last year, we are not drowning, we are fighting. And that's the fight for climate justice that exists in these communities as well. Now, the good news is that there are wonderful inspirational stories coming out of these communities as well. So there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot of inspiration to gain. We have so much to learn from the historical challenges to oppression, to how systems of power have been campaigned against and overturned. And if you think about campaigns like those for civil rights or the anti-apartheid movements, that's where we can draw inspiration. And as you said earlier in your setup, Kate, you were talking about how Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, we can draw inspiration from those fighting back from the front lines of the climate crisis. They're fighting back with solutions. These are the communities that are the first adapters to the climate crisis. And now thinking about your work with the Fairtrade Foundation, it's so important to restate one central message that farmers, like your own families and those of Dr. Mithika, farmers need better incomes and they need financial support to adapt to these changing, to the changing climate, right? And so this is what I think of as a supply and demand approach. So at the supply end, when we work with farmers, with their communities and grassroots communities to build up their power, when they organize themselves, when they start to campaign for their rights, as we do at 350, we are in effect helping them to unlock their own agency. And that's a really powerful moment, right? When we help to unlock their own agency, to campaign for their own rights, and help them to advocate for the systemic fixes and the long-term financial support that needs to be secured by governments, that's fixing the supply side, right? And that's fixing things at the supply side. We're helping also at the same time to create a network of really powerful community care and meaningful peer-to-peer learning, which is so powerful. And of course, when organizations like ours that have good platforms, when we amplify their stories, we contribute to what Mithika was talking about as bringing home the manifestations of the climate crisis. So those of us with access to the right platforms can share these stories to a broad global audience and broaden the discourse. When we do that in a global context and to concerned and involved audiences like those who might be listening today, in effect, we are strengthening the voices of farmers on what we might think of as the demand side. In their fight for fairer working conditions, securing fairer rates for their produce, it's simple but powerful interventions like that, which can help all of us to meet these multiple challenges ahead of us all. So more power to people like yourselves.
No, definitely, definitely. And I believe that is where the change actually happens. Yeah, thank you, such great panelists. I love the passion. You've felt it, you've touched it. So I'm sure the audience is happy to hear from you. So working with Fairtrade Africa, I hear every day and I interact with farmers and workers doing really incredible work to take care of the climate effects on their farms. They use some of the Fairtrade premiums to plant trees, to sharing knowledge on protecting biodiversity within their communities, to buying newer varieties of products that are more, of seedlings that are more resistant to the climate changes. Whether it's sustainable farming, activism, or anything else, panelists, can you share with our audience examples of positive grassroots climate activism that has inspired you? I don't know who wants to go first. Very briefly, one activism that has inspired you. Maybe I could start with Louis.
Yeah, sure. I was lucky enough, just 2 weeks ago, I just got back from the Amazon, in the part of the Amazon that falls into Ecuador. And I was lucky enough to be a guest in my friend's indigenous community, in the Napa region in Serena. My friend Leo Serda, who's part of the Kichwa Nation there. And the I mean the whole system they have going on there is unbelievable to see humans living in that level of understanding and harmony of their environment, especially someone that's so important to the planet and its existence, as the Amazon. But yeah, I was lucky enough to be there during a march where all the nations, Kichwa and Waorani and other nations in the Napa region, marched against illegal mining that's been going on there, and to see the level of unity and comradeship, and understanding and empathy for each other, and support was one of the most moving things I've seen, and to actually be able to be there and witness it, not just what they're fighting for, because I was there in like pristine Amazon, but also the knowledge they have for the biodiversity there and how to exist within nature and with it, how they don't see themselves as separate from it, but also how amazingly they organize and how it's done with love and how it's done, with a position of sovereignty. These people are the sovereigns of the land, and that's something that we need to listen to. So yeah, that was an incredible grassroots movement that I experienced only 2 weeks ago firsthand, and inspired me massively. So shouts to everyone, the Yuturi, Wami, Leo Serda, and Napa Resiste, in Tena and the Napa region, fighting illegal mining at the moment.
Yeah, that's quite impactful and quite timely as well. Dr. Mithika, I don't know if there is an example you'd like to share. You work in 44 countries in Africa, over 40 countries in Africa. I'm sure you have some examples.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there are so many examples, and the people leading their struggles at a very local level to free themselves from dominance. And one of the most vivid one, I'll mention the most because there are so many, is the power of the people. Just 2 years ago, the government of Kenya wanted to appropriate and lease the land for indigenous communities. Actually, UN designated the World Heritage in one of the coastal towns of Lamu. And, a local community rose against this with the support of many organizations and allies at even international level. They launched a campaign, went to court in demonstrations, and we joined them and we worked with them, and that the coal plant, the government was and released to the pressure of the people. So that's a very, very practical campaign that people can, once mobilized and once they understand their rights, the farmers, the producer groups are to them. The Chinese actually bolted out because we worked with these farmers, and we were able to even cut off, ensure that the African Development Bank cuts off its funding. The US funders, pension funders, cut off their. We put pressure on them in the global North-South solidarity. They cut off their funding until the government gave up, and the masterstroke was actually the victory in court. So this is a very good example of how we can work. We need, once our communities are empowered, we build their capacity so that they become their own voices, then they can win in battle, including this climate crisis.
Yeah, that's really powerful. When the people stand up, then collectively they're able to really change the course of a positive and even a negative action. Nama, a short example before we get into the intersection of the climate space.
Yes, and I love that you use the word intersection, because actually the story that I have is one that I admire so much for the intersectionality of it. It's a story and an example from my home country, India, and a small village called Kedia, where a focus on what they call living soils has really helped them transform their agricultural approach. And it's helped this little agricultural community get their independence from the agrochemical industry and the big agrochemical players. So they're now using solutions like vermiculture, soil conservation, partner crops, and organic farming to wean themselves off pesticides and insecticides completely. So for several years now, they haven't used any chemicals in their farms. And this has released them from historical financial debt. And by putting a clear commercial value on human labor, it has brought the women of the village into clear central decision making. And that to me is such a beautiful example of how you can secure gender justice at the same time as you're, securing environmental stability and getting financial independence. And with organic culture and the kind of crop conservation that they're doing, it's also helping in very immediate ways to combat the climate crisis. So it's stories like these that give me a lot of inspiration. I'm sure I cannot do justice to the full story in the few minutes that we have today, but I'd love for people who are listening to start investigating more of these examples of soil conservation or chemical-free agriculture in communities that are local to their own countries too, and start to support them more intentionally. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah. The call to action, really. So going back again to what we touched on earlier, Louis, on colonialism, the legacy of colonialism is still visible and deeply unfair in the global trade system that we live in today. Producers in industries with roots in slavery, like cocoa and sugar, like in Ghana, in most of the African countries, or even in South America, in Latin America, where you are, cannot earn enough to live on, even though those industries are highly profitable. In your work on the climate justice, what effects of that racist colonial past have you come across?
I mean, I have not come across anything that it hasn't affected. Maybe that's a better way to say. I guess through the exploitation of people and the natural environment as the very fuel for the Industrial Revolution, colonialism birthed the climate catastrophe that we find ourselves in today. It isn't the global South, Africa, island nations, South America, Pacific, Caribbean are underdeveloped. They're overexploited, and it's the places that have caused the climate change. These colonial empires, Europe and the West, that must take responsibility and pay for the problem that they've created. I think it's also important to remember and remind ourselves that this colonial past, as is mentioned in the IPCC, isn't just the past, but it's present. We live in a colonial status quo. The setup based, whether it's based on trade solutions that come from that have their roots in colonialism and transatlantic slave trade, or whether it's the current system of people that are the first line being the primary producers also of the lifestyle of the Western world. It's the same hand that enslaved my ancestors and took them from Africa and took them to the Caribbean to work on plantations. It's the same hand that's destroying these pristine habitats and threatening indigenous communities around the world now. And it's the same. Whilst I was in the Amazon, it's the exact same hand, the same companies, the Canadian, the British, the French, the Chinese companies that are mining for minerals or oil in these special places on our planet. It's the exact same mindset. It's the same extractivism, and I think it's interesting because we really need to work on that link and understand that link is not in the past. My ancestors were suffered by that colonial hand in the past, but they're being colonized now, indigenous communities around the world. And it's the last battle, because these indigenous communities around the world may make up 8% of the population of the planet, but they protect 85% of biodiversity. And you know, more to where I grew up as well, the racist colonial past has also separated people of color in the West, like myself, from their roots and their ties to the land, and that's been a purposeful alienation from nature, to allow us to be instruments for extraction to support these colonial empires that still exist and still hold the power, and are responsible for this. So it's important in that sense as well, and as a sense of purpose and identity for us to reclaim our connection to the land, and our responsibility and our right to live on a healthy planet that isn't run by extractivism, but is run by people being stewards of the planet. And we learn that from, you know, Black and brown and indigenous communities around the world.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how race divide also gets into climate. So the climate activism and the policy makers most visible in the media tend to be from a white European or a North American background, just as you were saying, Louis. This seems to exclude the people often who are also the climate experts and activism on the ground, with most of them who really live and experience the climate crisis. So maybe Louis could also chime in and tell us what we can do, and the people watching at home, what can they do to change this? Does the climate movement become actively more inclusive, and how can we really reduce the anti-racism in climate change?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's absolutely true. Like, white saviorism is rife, and it just continues the colonial legacy that we are fighting against, essentially. Something that came out of COP that, you know, I know everyone here will have experienced as well, is that colonial solutions will not fix colonial problems, and having white European and North American narratives leading this climate change solution misses out, you know, 99% of the story. And as I said, you know, we need to amplify Black, brown, and indigenous voices because they have the answers. And what people can do, you know, white activists and policymakers and people that have the platform essentially need to just step aside and listen, because, you know, more so these indigenous communities, these Black and brown communities that are on the front line have the answers because they have been and know and work with nature on a daily basis. You know, particularly like smallhold family farms as well. It's exactly the same situation. So people of color, indigenous communities need to not just be elevated. We need to not just be megaphones for them, and white people that are in this world not just be megaphones, but need to be in the front and center of policy making rooms. And COP26 was a huge example of the failure of that, because it was just, again, colonial leaders saying this is what we think, and it's not enough, and they're missing the point every time. So yeah, they need to be, and people need to be the megaphones for our brothers and sisters on the front line. Yeah.
I mean, if we start talking COP26, we'd probably need another whole event. I don't know, Nama, what you'd like the people watching at home to do to change this narrative?
Well, you're right. If we started going into the COP26, it's a whole other story, but it's important to think about, nonetheless, who isn't allowed in the room, as Louis was saying, right? And who isn't there. And so 350's entire campaign at the COP26 was about bringing voices of people to the front and making sure that those who were not allowed to be present by one way or another were being represented. And here it's really important to think about who and how we are representing them. So yes, it is a case of global injustice, but also I also wanted to go back to how you had originally framed the question, Kate. It isn't just a case of the global North getting more attention than the global South. That is by far the bigger problem, but still there is a deliberate silencing of some voices and amplification of some others. Right? And even in the global North, we do see in many different social contexts, in so many subtle ways, we see certain communities being pushed to the side, even in privileged societies. And so it's really important for us to think about the imbalance in our own communities as well as at a global level. So really being open to that big picture of who's being left out of the important decisions that will start to affect them really strongly. And if you think about what our people can do to change this, I think it's really important for everyone to consider closely your own privilege. Not just in terms of how much or how little you have, but in what barriers you've not had to ford over to get to the starting line, right? What are the structural systemic barriers that you've not had to deal with, but others have? That's privilege in action. So the movement for climate justice is certainly undergoing its own transformation. There's a lot of introspection and a lot of determined change from Northern-led campaigns that focused only on power, sometimes reinforcing and perpetuating those same systems of power, as Louis was saying, the white saviorism, right, which is so deeply problematic, to now looking much more meaningfully at grassroots and community-led building up of people power. So thinking about ways in which we can reclaim power and help our brothers and sisters to reclaim power as well. Building power with people, not white saviors helping communities and thereby subtly still holding power over them. So that's the distinction that is really important for us to make. And one example, if I may, just to share the kind of work that 350 does, which gives me so much meaning, is, when the Pacific Climate Warriors most recently have held a 3-day training in the Philippines to teach climate-affected communities in Fiji to assemble and maintain their own solar power energy. So they're literally putting energy and power into the hands of people and disrupting traditional power structures in such a profound way, which will then inspire so many others to take that kind of action and hopefully roll out more and more community-owned solar projects like that. And to me, that's what inclusive climate justice looks like in action. And that's what we're hoping to change soon.
Yeah, that reminds me of the Fairtrade model as well. What I love about it is the consumers actually supporting the farmers. When you buy that Fairtrade product, that impact is going directly to the person who grew it, most likely a Black person. So it's more of collaboration. So ideally, there shouldn't be a black and white when it comes to fighting such global activities, and things that really affect all of us. Storm Eunice, all these things that are happening in the North, in the South, they affect us in the same way. So moving on now, as we're trying also to look beyond COP26 and we're moving towards COP27, Dr. Mithika, the latest IPCC report highlights again how unequal the impact of climate change is. In the light of this and the upcoming COP27, what do you want to see policymakers do, and how can activists and campaigners make that happen?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that's a very relevant question, which I've mentioned that we are in Kigali right now, and that is exactly what we are trying to figure out. I mentioned during my affair that it is the discussion between elites. Even if it is at UN level, it doesn't trickle down to where it is supposed to be. The people have only become the recipients of the policies they have not been part of. And as a public policy analyst and specialist, policy making will not end without policy implementation. And so the concern for us as activists, and particularly climate justice, is the issue. Actually, climate justice is that issue of procedural justice. Of whom are you doing the policies? So you go to the UNFCCC meetings every year, they have become jamborees, is the largest convergence of people all over the world. Actually, the UNFCCC conferences are the largest, only second to the UN General Assembly in the world. It's the most well-attended meeting. But when we go there, who goes there? So the concern has been now, and the issue of procedural justice is that this farmer who is suffering the impacts of climate change as those solutions. And if you want these farmers really to implement this and to be part of the process of implementation and solution, they need to really sit on the table in framing these policies. And that is what we are doing in the countdown to the COP27, that we are mobilizing. We want to amplify the voices of the farmers. In the meeting here, we are also having the main farmers organizations, the East African Farmers Federation, the Pan-African Farmers Organizations, and smallholder representatives from Rwanda and those others, to ensure that their voices now are heard. And that is what we are compelling our policy makers to do. That for over years, you have failed because you have failed to include the voices of the people. That's why it is very difficult for them to implement. So the solutions come from them. And thankfully, as opposed to the Kyoto Protocol, which expired and now succeeded by the Paris Agreement, due to our fights, due to our convergence and movements with 350.org, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, the Climate Justice Movement, we were able to ensure that now this is the role of the non-state actors, the young people, women, civil society, the businesses and all is anchored in the Paris Agreement and implementation of the nationally determined contributions at local level, which means our role is defined there. So when we are going there, we are telling them we are there and not as actually appendages, we are there as partners, because not only government which can address climate change, it can only be addressed by all of us. It is so enormous challenge that we need the smallholder farmers, we need fair trade movement, we need climate justice movement, we need faith-based movement, we need the fisher folk movement, we need everybody, researchers and those others, so that we defeat this challenge. So that is the voice we are telling our people, and we are preparing. We have launched our strategy in the countdown, and we are calling upon our international partners, building the North-South movement, North-South solidarity, those in UK, those in the United States, and those others. There is no boundary on what we should do. We should work together.
Yeah, excellent, excellently put. I just love the passion in this room. And the audience is also really up and active, asking all questions. We thank everybody really for signing up for this event today, and for all those who have pre-submitted questions on our panel in advance. Encouragingly, the question which came up by far most frequently asked is, what is something that people watching in the UK can do to support those most affected by the climate crisis right now? That's one of the common questions that came from the audience. And I'll give a chance to all our panelists to really answer this. What can the UK people do? Let's start with you, Louis. In 1 minute, how do we help our audience?
In 1 minute, how do we save the world? Good question. I think this is always the question that comes up, and I'm always like trying to look for a better answer, but it's always quite simple. Like, especially from the UK perspective, one, like, identify who you are in this. Like, identify, like Nama said, identify what privileges you experience and why your lifestyle is able to be the way it is. Especially somewhere like UK and Ireland, like UK, you only have to walk around London for 5 minutes to see the colonial legacy of that country. So it's really important to isolate the privilege, not just in the modern times, but also from a historical perspective, and recognize that, you know, I think the next thing I think people can really do in the UK is recognize that historical legacy and have the difficult conversations with people around you, and understand that, you know, as the UK, I could not be prouder if the moment finally comes, which it should come, is that we hold our hands up as a country that basically invented colonialism, invented the original destruction of the environment to say we owe the world all the riches that the British Empire has essentially stole. And we owe them in reparations in fixing this climate crisis we find ourselves in. And particularly people of color in the UK, we have a unique position of understanding that deeply because our existence is completely down and due to that. I think also people in the UK need to reclaim their access to nature, particularly people of color as well, and act as a bridge and act as megaphones. And I think, yeah, my last point is the people that are on the front line right now in the global south, whether you're white or you're a person of color and you have ancestral links to these places, we must be the megaphones for these places because these indigenous communities have the solutions, have the knowledge of how, as a planet, as how humanity, we can exist better with the world. And it's, it's never too late because every degree matters. Everything that we do will mitigate and make better our situation. So there's never an end game solution to this. It's a constant battle that we must do. But what we're fighting for is something amazing. We can live in an incredible world. I was sitting in the Amazon thinking, I feel the healthiest I've ever felt. I feel amazing being surrounded by this level of life and nature and this pristine, healthy environment that, we evolved in, we're supposed to be in. And this could be across the planet. We have the ability and the knowledge, the technology, the science, and the want and need to have a much better world where it's not just better for climate, but sexism, racism, gender equality, economic equality, all falls under this. So it's everything to fight for, and that's exciting.
Yeah, and how can they use their art and music? I know you're passionate about that to also create change.
Well, I've always felt that art and music is the thing that people turn to when words are not enough. It's what people use to talk about difficult situations and understand and create empathy. And empathy is something that we're lacking in a massive way as a planet. And I think there's nothing like art to really break down those barriers and allow empathy between people that normally wouldn't feel it for each other. And we're all on this planet. So I think, if you are an artist as well, this is the time to use that art for this, because this is the fundamental thing that's going to be applying to all of our existence here.
Yeah, true. Well said. Nama, any words of wisdom to our audience in the UK?
Well, not so much words of wisdom as an invitation to join in, because this is a fight for us all, really. And, there's many amongst us who will have read the IPCC report with a heavy heart, and it's a particularly heavy time for folks right now. There's so much going on in the world that feels really strong and deep and pulls us down. But it's also important for us to think about what lies ahead and to think about it with energy and with inspiration. So thinking about your own agency and think about, once again, what power exists inside of you, and ask yourselves, how can you put your shoulder to the shift that is needed right now? And really dig in deep and find that, because to secure climate justice is going to require unprecedented collective effort. Mm-hmm. It's going to mean adequate investment. It's going to mean political will. It's going to require funds for adaptation, for mitigation. There's just so much money that needs to flow in the right directions. We need to set aside reparations for loss and damage, as Louis was reminding us. And so really it's about everyone starting to think about how we can put our efforts into this collective action that's required. So it is a decisive year. There's no denying that. And as we're heading into the year that's going to lead up to the COP27, the Africa COP, as it's being referred to, it's really important for many organizations, not just my own. So 350.org, along with local groups in the climate movement, we're mobilizing together and really starting to call out fossil fuel companies as well as the governments and the financial institutions that have supported them all these years. So we're calling them out. And in this year for climate justice, we're going to see a lot of peaceful actions around the world. We're going to see marches, gatherings, webinars, murals, art, action, all sorts of visual installations and holographic projections. So I would say it's an invitation to, as Louis said, use your art. Use your heart as well, right? Bring your heart into the climate movement and do whatever suits you. Join in that action in whatever form suits you best, because that's the only way that we, as the people that will live this future, can set that different path ahead and redirect our human society towards following that different path and setting the impacts that the world really needs to see next. So I'm really hopeful that through moments like these of coming together with power, with fantastic, inspiring people like yourselves, to come together and start to think how we might combine our energies and start to build a truly inclusive movement.
Yeah. Thank you, Nama. And lastly, Dr. Mithika, what do you think the people watching in the UK should do to start supporting the people affected by the climate crisis?
Thank you very much. I think I want to follow with what Nama said. I think we have respective capabilities and responsibilities. And it is well defined, even in the convention. And we don't even need the convention. We need really to express that compassion with the people who are really suffering the impacts of climate change in Mozambique, in Madagascar, in Malawi, and those other countries which are affected by climate-related cyclones and so forth. And so actually, this is the issue of humanity. How are we going really to empathize and sympathize with these people? So science tells us that we need really deep emission reduction at domestic level by industrialized countries. They have been reluctant. They want to live their own profligate lifestyles without changing anything, but transferring the burden of action to the people who are still overburdened by the impacts of climate change. So my message to the UK audience is that put pressure on your governments so that they really adopt systems which ensure we transition to low carbon, climate resilient future. So that's one. The other one is even for them to adopt that really sustainable modes of production and consumption. And finally, to urge and put their government pressure and make it even an election policy issue to ensure that the UK government increases funding for climate action, but not mitigation-centric action, but also adaptation and loss and damage in countries which are really undergoing very difficult times because of the impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time does fly when the conversations are passionate and deep and quite engaging. I think from my end also to the UK audience is to really support sustainability. Look keenly to support organizations and products that really have the heart of the smallholder producers in the middle of it, just like Fairtrade products. Just think sustainability amongst all the other things that everybody else has said. I really want to thank you very much, Dr. Mithika, Louis VI, and Nama for their time today, for joining us to answer these very important questions. I'm sure we can all agree it has been fascinating to hear directly from you and your varying perspectives on this issue of unfairness within the climate crisis. It really is critical to help us understand what it means to work towards overcoming this together. To everybody who submitted a question, thank you very much. They've been overwhelming. We appreciate all the participation of our Fairtrade supporters, and I hope you found this event as insightful as I did today. Please do go to our Fairtrade website. There you will find remaining events you can attend as part of Fairtrade Fortnight 2022. We still have some very exciting plans to come and other events that you can watch again online with expert guest speakers looking at how Fairtrade is working with producers to combat the climate crisis from different perspectives. And while all events are free to attend, if you'd like to support farmers and workers on the front line of climate crisis, please donate what you can today by scanning the QR code on your screen or visiting the Fairtrade website. Don't forget to follow us, to like us on Twitter, on Instagram, hashtag Fairtrade Fortnight, hashtag Choose the World You Love. Thank you once again for your time, and we hope to see you at our upcoming events on Fairtrade Fortnight, Choose the World You Want Festival 2022. Thank you and have a great day.